This is one of the oldest housing estates in Singapore. Bukit Ho Swee is home to some 80,000 people. For those who can remember, it was here where Singapore's worst fire occurred 27 years ago. It was in a squatter hut on Tiong Bahru Road that the fire first broke out. Fanned by a strong breeze, the flames leapt from hut to hut, engulfing an entire squatter colony. Within minutes, Bukit Ho Swee was ablaze, and the smoke from the flames could be seen miles away.
每一个人就是跑来跑去，好像哦，他忙他的，他忙他们的东西，好像他们哦，他赶快他们跑，带老的带小的，好像有的是拿一点东西这样啊，匆匆忙忙的逃了。每一个人很匆忙的，因为火很大嘛。
哇，真大，真正大到哇一大烧，不晓讲就对啦，规人都要忘记了。我就话迄人都要忘记，走甲不离冷哦。
全部内面几个是烟的，啊，你烧后的内面哇，惊死人的臭，你知无？一个礼拜内面敢若死人，因为迄阵就堆啊，精神也有，烧啊真正多。
We were getting hundreds and hundreds of calls coming in from people around that area yelling for help, and some of them in panic-stricken voice, they were yelling for fire engine because they could see smoke and fire maybe half a mile away. So that created a great confusion in the control room as to where the fire actually was.
Fire engines from all over the island rushed to the scene, but the firemen, hastily called back from their Hari Raya holiday, did not expect to fight such a blaze. Panic-stricken residents tried desperately to save their possessions by carrying whatever they could away from the approaching fire.
And there were women and children running everywhere. The occupants of the atap houses were carrying out all their belongings. I've seen several trucks going back to their huts, trying to cut away as much as the property they can, because there is a whole life savings in the house. So can you imagine, we are trying to rush in to do our work, and you get the crowds or the occupants rushing out. And with all the onlookers, in fact, it made our job a nightmare.
To add to the confusion, many residents tried to help, but it was a futile effort. The fire and heat had become too intense and the smoke suffocating. Soon there was nothing they could do but see everything they owned consumed by the flames.
Cái大起咯，是真正大了，连要落就塌死了，所以规个庙巷内面哦，放了真正侪战车啦、大厨啦、包袱啦，什么都有的啊。因为迄是真正大了，只人夺命嘞，连物件本无可能行的啊，连迄车吼本驶袂出来啦，就塌了咧，全部就去烧了。
The fire raged on for 6 more hours, and it wasn't till 8:20 that night before it was brought under control. For 3 more days, pockets of fire had to be doused to prevent more outbreaks. In all, some 3 million gallons of water were used. Over 60 acres of the squatter colony was reduced to charred ruins. But it wasn't the first time that such a disaster had happened in Bukit Ho Swee. In August 1934, a fire had raged through the same area. It cut a path of destruction across the squatter colony, making some 500 families homeless. But still the people came back, putting together pieces of wood, cardboard and zinc, making themselves new huts. This place, named after Te Ho Swee, a wealthy merchant and philanthropist, was home to some of the poorest in Singapore. There was no proper sanitation and hardly any electricity or water supply. Rubbish and waste were dumped everywhere, and the ditches that snaked through the kampong carried its stench. Many of the residents had to rear animals like chickens and pigs to earn a bit more money. Amidst the poverty and squalor spread infectious diseases like tuberculosis. Secret societies like the 08, 24 and 36 staked their claims here. But the 1961 fire left nothing for anyone. Life savings, possessions, everything was reduced to cinders. Overnight, 16,000 people were made homeless and penniless.
隔天哦，汽油一灯没有了，通通都烧掉了。那时哦，西边的有人拿个马达看住了，我们哦要有那边好像证明是我们是那边居民哦，我们才可以进去了。
我的自己咧全部烧了，两种物件哦，3块什么完全无可能摕啦，只带到一身躯的3块走出来啊。然后咧厝边头尾咧啊，全部的厝完全烧到当中变破了了。
Public and government response to the victims' plight was spontaneous. 4 schools around the area, including Kim Seng East, were immediately converted into relief centers. Donations of cash, food and bedding were received. Many organizations offered their services, like the British Army, whose cooks made sure none would go hungry. Clothing and cash allowances were also given to help the families tide over the difficult period. A day after the fire, the Prime Minister visited the victims at the relief centers and promised them new homes at the site of the fire within 9 months. In the meantime, new flats in estates like Queenstown were immediately made available for the victims. But still, the Housing and Development Board had to tackle the task of rebuilding Bukit Ho Swee for the affected families.
Never before has the Singapore construction industry undertaken to build on such a massive scale. So we had a plan, a 5-year plan to build at least 10,000 units, and over and above that, now we meet this challenge to resettle about 16,000 fire victims. And it's a question of management. How do you bring all the components of such massive construction together and put them on schedule?
To keep on schedule, work began immediately after the government acquired the fire site and its surrounding areas. In all, 12,000 units were to be built. Emergency one-room flats were constructed at a rate of 3.5 units a day. Within weeks, a new housing estate began to take shape. By February 1962, more than 3,000 flats were completed and ready for occupation. By that time too, all the affected families had been allocated new homes, either in the new flats of Bukit Ho Swee or the other housing estates. Those who chose to return found Bukit Ho Swee a changed place. Instead of the squalor and dirt were modern high-rise buildings with social amenities like community centers, schools and children's playgrounds. It was a vast difference from the kampung they saw devoured by fire only 9 months before. Today, Bukit Ho Swee Estate is undergoing yet more changes. The emergency flats built to house the victims have all been demolished to make way for newer and better ones. Yet despite these changes, Bukit Ho Swee will long be remembered as a place where the most disastrous fire occurred and where phoenix-like a new estate emerged from the smouldering ashes. 30th of May 1959. It was the dawn of a new day. For the first time in history, Singapore was going to have a fully elected government. That day, large crowds gathered at the various polling stations, eager to cast their votes. Steps towards self-government started 4 years back in a series of talks with the colonial authorities. In 1955, soon after the Labour Front government took office, Chief Minister David Marshall led the first delegation to London. He had hoped to convince the British to grant us self-rule, but they argued that Singapore was not yet ready. Politically, it was unstable, torn by communist-instigated strikes and student unrest all over the island. The next Chief Minister, Lim Yew Hock, led an all-party delegation to London twice for constitutional talks. He had used tough tactics against the pro-communists in Singapore, and this won the British over. Many turned up to welcome the delegation home in 1958. They looked forward to the end of colonial rule. Singapore would hence have control over all its domestic affairs. It would have a legislature with 51 members, fully elected by the Singapore citizens and led by the Prime Minister. A local head of state, the Yang di-Pertuan Negara, would also be appointed. It was announced that election would be held a year later. This created much excitement all around the island. There was election fever. In 1955, there were only 6 political parties, but now 7 more were formed to contest the election. These 13 parties geared up for the contest. They included the Singapore People's Alliance, the People's Action Party, the Liberal Socialist Party, and the Citizens Party. And while there were only 69 candidates in 1955, the number was 194 in 1959. In the 1955 election, there was only a registered electorate of 320,000. But in 1959, it had almost doubled. The Singapore Citizenship Ordinance of 1957 gave voting rights to more than 200,000 immigrants, and for the first time, voting was made compulsory. Altogether, there was now an electorate of 590,000. Politics became mass-based. The stakes were high. The party that won would lead Singapore into the new era of internal self-rule. Issues in this election went beyond language and race. Who could lead Singapore to independence, and who had the best program for the future? Even before the campaign proper, the People's Action Party took the offensive against the ruling Labour Front. It revealed that Education Minister Chew Swee Kee had accepted $700,000 in bribes from a foreign source. Together with other allegations of corruption, this put the Labour Front in disarray. It hastily reorganized itself to form the Singapore People's Alliance in a bid to retain political power. It fielded only 39 candidates. It was the People's Action Party that set the pace for the election. Although there were only 4 PAP members in the Legislative Assembly, it decided to make a bid for power. It threw a surprise by contesting all 51 seats. It introduced lunchtime political rallies and addressed large crowds, during which it explained its agenda for the future. It argued for a common market with Malaya to help solve the island's economic problems. It also promised a clean, honest, and efficient government. The SPA charged that the PAP candidates had practiced favoritism in the discharge of their duties in the City Council. However, many people had been impressed by the work of the PAP city councillors. And as the campaign progressed, it became clear that the People's Action Party was going to win.
Well, they had such a clean record. They had a positive agenda. They were extremely able.
They themselves were well organized of all the other parties. In fact, they were so well organized that candidates were even in uniform.
Most important, through its contacts with the workers and the Chinese educated, the PAP had identified itself with the lower income masses. For many who voted on 30th of May, it was their first participation in the democratic process, the first time they had a say in selecting their political leaders. And at the end of the day, the SPA lost ground. It only won 4 seats, polling 20% of the votes. The PAP were the clear victors, winning 43 seats and 53.4% of the votes. The party had seen changes in the electorate, the fact that it was now dominated by the lower income Chinese educated masses.
I think the PAP was the only party that realized these changes and adapted its strategy accordingly. First of all, it pitched its appeal to the broad-based electorate, to the man in the street with his more socialist economic program, with emphasis on the creation of jobs, on housing, on women's charter, for example. And on the other hand, it pitched its appeal to the Chinese educated voters. On the whole, I think the PAP was able to really shift the focus from chamber politics to mass politics in the streets. It was able to mount successfully house-to-house campaigning and hold election rallies very successfully. Particularly, speeches were made, in Mandarin, in dialects, to appeal to the Chinese voters. And on the other hand, unfortunately for the Lim Yu-hock government, it had the odium of being anti-Chinese educated and anti-Chinese because of the arrest by the government of many left-wing activists, Chinese educated activists in the trade union and the Chinese schools. And the opposing parties, those opposed to the PAP, will also be beset by internal squabbles, and the result was that many of the votes were split.
2 days later, on the 1st of June 1959, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew met British Governor William Goode. He was asked to name his new cabinet, and this he did, only after he was assured that 8 PAP political detainees, including Devan Nair, Lim Chun Seong, and James Puducherry, would be released. For the new government, the work had just begun.
Our objective was not an independent Singapore, is to work for a united Malaya. So, secondly, and here I think one of the things that people today should bear in mind, self-government had one safeguard, as we conceived it, to make it impossible for the communists really to seize power by violence.
The PAP knew too well that within the party itself, the uneasy alliance between the communists and the non-communists would soon have to end. It wasn't too long before the communist elements made a bid for power. But until then, it had a more immediate task to complete, to nurse the economy to health and to provide jobs and houses for the people. At a mass rally at the Padang on the 3rd of June, the new government promised action for the future. The struggle for Singapore's survival had only just begun.
Our 5-year plan calls for the laying down the basis of a future socialist society. Saudara-saudara, saudari-saudari setanah air, merdeka! Lagi sekali yang bersemangat, merdeka!
These are just ordinary copper pieces, raw and faceless. But from them a nation's currency is molded, and when circulated, each commands a value greater than its own. Money, with which we buy goods and services. It's a medium of exchange between buyer and seller, a measure of wealth, an integral part of the economy. Money was first introduced to the Malay Peninsula through trade. In the early years, it came in all shapes and sizes. Later, there were the Spanish dollar, the merchant tokens, and the Japanese banana notes, so called because of the banana designs on them. We began using the Malayan dollar not long after the Second World War. This was issued by the Board of Commissioners of Currency of Malaya and British Borneo. It was a strong dollar, backed 100% by gold and foreign reserves. In 1959, a central bank was set up in Malaya, and there were plans for it to take over the duties of issuing and circulating currency. But then Singapore separated from Malaysia in 1965, and it was hoped that both countries would continue using the same currency.
The advantages of having a common currency is that you don't have to worry about foreign exchange, especially for traders and people who travel up and down Malaysia. There's no question of two different rates of exchange, and also that currency has been in existence for so long, people know it, so there is a continuity.
Singapore and Malaysia had always been seen as one economic unit, and it would definitely be easier if both countries traded in the same currency as in the past. But there were problems involved. The Singapore government preferred to stick to the existing system, in which all currency was issued by the Currency Board, while the Malaysian government wanted its central bank to play a greater role in monetary matters. For Singapore, the shock of separation was still being felt, and a drastic change in its monetary system would have affected the economy. Singapore relied heavily on trade, and economic stability was very important to its survival. The negotiations broke over one issue.
Question of control over the assets of the currency, the backing of the currency. Who controls it? For every dollar that was issued, there was an asset backing it. So the question was, now, how do we control this asset now that the two governments are separate? So the breakup was a question of control of the assets. On that, we broke.
It came as a shock when it was announced that both countries would issue separate currencies. In some quarters, there was concern.
Singapore had just separated from Malaysia in 1965, so the concern was whether she could be viable in an economic entity with its own currency. The shock of being a separate political entity was already bad enough, and now it had to be a separate currency entity as well. Singapore was just trying to find its own feet, and we were afraid that we might lose some international competitiveness by this currency split.
But there was no turning back. A currency board chaired by the finance minister was set up to issue the new currency. Like the old dollar, the new one was pegged at 0.290299 grams of gold, or 2 shillings 4 pence. And just like the old, it was backed 100% in gold and foreign assets. The new notes were issued on 12th June 1967. that day, many went to the banks to change old notes for new ones. Because the old currency could still be used alongside the new, the transition was an easy one. We also signed an interchangeability agreement with both the Malaysian and Brunei governments, putting all three currencies at par. The coins arrived in November that year, freshly minted from London. But this was also the time when we ran into a currency crisis. London had devalued the sterling. The new Singapore dollar kept its gold parity, now worth an equivalent of 2 shillings 8 pence. But those holding on to the old Malayan dollar were anxious, as this meant that it was now only worth 85 cents of the new dollar. There was a long queue outside the currency board, as people rushed to get rid of their old notes, afraid that its value would drop even further. Only after the public was assured that there were enough new notes for all to change did the crisis end. Since then, as our industrialization program took off and our economy expanded, confidence in our dollar also grew. In 1973, following worldwide trends, we floated our currency. This meant that the value of our dollar would depend mainly on the forces of demand and supply. The interchangeability agreement with Malaysia also lapsed at that time. This meant that the two currencies would no longer be on par. There was yet another queue at Empress Place. Many gave up their Malaysian ringgits in their possession. It was a complete switch to using the Singapore dollar. This ended an age-old union completely.
The concern was whether if the Malaysian ringgit fell below the Singapore dollar, which it did, whether this would disrupt trade between the two countries. Those who had activities or money in both countries, they had to come to a certain choice here. But at that time, Singapore was doing quite well as a country, so we did benefit in a sense that many businesses and individuals chose to locate in Singapore.
It's a reflection of our economic strength that over the years, from the Orchid series to the Bird and Chip series, our currency has not only remained stable, but also increased in value.
The way to maintain currency value would be to have a strong economy and also a strong balance of payments. So on those two counts, Singapore has done quite well since 1973. She has succeeded in not only growing very fast, but also in attracting a lot of foreign capital. So her balance of payments is quite strong.
Today, the Currency Board still ensures that our dollar is 100% backed by gold and foreign assets, while the MAS keeps a close watch on our exchange rate. For Singapore, a sound economic policy has enabled our economy to expand over the years. Together with internal political stability, this has ensured confidence in our dollar. And now it is generally accepted as a medium of exchange throughout the countries of Southeast Asia. June 1962, about 300 graduates assembled at the Victoria Theatre. For the graduates, it was a proud occasion as they received their degrees from their Chancellor, Datuk Lee Kong Chian. They were the first batch of students to graduate from the University of Singapore. Tertiary education in Singapore began in 1905 when the Straits Settlement and Federated Malay States Government Medical School was established. Located at a former women's asylum, the school trained doctors who later formed the backbone of the health service. The school grew and was later renamed the King Edward VII College of Medicine. While medical studies had a head start, humanities and science began much later. Raffles College was opened in 1929. These students were trained in arts and science. Subjects such as English, history, geography, physics, chemistry, mathematics and education were taught. And in 1949, the Medical College was united with Raffles College to form the University of Malaya. It was to serve the needs of Malaya and Singapore. Later, another division was set up in Kuala Lumpur, and the university continued to function with 2 divisions. But in 1961, the federal government indicated that Malaya should have an independent national university, and so the 2 divisions split, and the University of Singapore was formed on 1st January 1962. The university was inaugurated at the stroke of midnight. One undergraduate recalls the occasion.
I remember the inauguration very clearly. We all assembled at one of the quadrangles in the Bukit Timah campus, and the ceremony was presided by Dato' Lee Kong Chian, who was then the Chancellor of the university. And there was some revelry, there was some festivities. Some of the students fired crackers, all of us cheered. But the significance of the moment did not strike us then.
It was a significant turning point for the University of Singapore, as it meant new directions for the university.
It became a national institution. It ceased to have to cater to the interests of 2 different countries. In the past, it was a University of Malaya situated in Singapore, catering to the needs of Malaya and Singapore. As a national institution, it was able to develop unilaterally according to the interests of the nation itself.
When I first joined the university, it was very much a colonial university. Almost 95% of the staff were expatriates, and gradually we turned to a situation where we had a large proportion of local teachers.
When the University of Singapore first started, it had only 4 faculties: arts, science and law at Bukit Timah, and medicine at Sepoy Lines. The student enrollment was about 2,000 and classes were small. For the undergraduates then, their aim was not merely to get a degree.
We went there with an open mind. We wanted to learn, and this learning included other subjects, other interests, athletics, for example. There was drama, there was music. Now, all these activities helped. It taught us how to interact, how to get on with people. When we came out, we were flexible. We could take whatever it is that society or the world at large had to give us.
It was also a brave new world for Singapore. In the mid-1960s, Singapore was a newly independent country. Economic development was the main concern of the government. There was a need to move from an economy based on cottage industries to export-oriented industries, which would create more jobs. In order to attract multinational firms, Singapore needed skilled manpower to service these industries. At the same time, construction projects such as housing required the skills of trained engineers. The immediate task of the university was then to provide the skilled manpower needed for national development. In 1968, Dr. Toh Chin Chai, the Minister of Science and Technology, was appointed as Vice-Chancellor. His aim was to harness the university to meet the demands of a rapidly industrializing society. Dr. Toh saw the need to establish new faculties, and in 1969, the Faculty of Engineering was set up at the Singapore Polytechnic. Professor Chin, then Dean of Engineering, recalls the initial problems.
All equipments we use for training and also classroom and other supporting facilities came from Polytechnic. And at the beginning, we had only 13 staff for 3 departments, which means the 13 staff have to teach all the courses in civil, electrical and mechanical engineering.
3 years later, in 1972, the university produced about 100 engineers, and the numbers have increased since then. Other sectors of the economy were also expanding. Singapore was developing into a banking and financial center. There were insufficient business and accountancy graduates. In 1969, the School of Accountancy and Business Administration was established.
It was rather popular. I think the students rather enjoyed it, partly because it was rather new, and partly because it was so much related to business world, and the students, with an eye on their future, would wanted to do something that was that they could really apply.
And to keep up with the building boom, there was a need for trained architects, so the Faculty of Architecture was set up in 1969. The addition of these new faculties resulted in the expansion of the university. By the late 60s, the university was spread out in 4 different areas. Bukit Timah campus housing law, arts, science, and the School of Accountancy and Business Administration. Faculty of Architecture at Lady Hill. The Faculty of Medicine at College Road. And Engineering Faculty at Prince Edward Road. By 1969, the student enrollment had doubled to 4,000. Bukit Timah could not accommodate all the faculties, and at the same time, it was prone to flooding during heavy thunderstorms. Hence, there was a need to house the university in a larger single site. Ken Rich provided a solution. With the space available, all the faculties occupying some 400 acres of land could be housed in one area. In 1972, the groundbreaking ceremony took place and construction began in earnest. By the late 70s, the buildings were completed and the faculties began to move in. At about the same time, discussions took place on the need for a strong single university due to falling student enrollment at Nanyang, and also to provide greater opportunities for research and teaching. The government decided that Nanyang University was to merge with the University of Singapore. And in 1980, the National University of Singapore was formed. Today, the university at Kentridge has expanded to 8 faculties. New courses such as Japanese studies, psychology, and human resource management have been introduced. The university is meeting new demands. As Singapore develops into a research and information center, the university has kept abreast, training students in computer science and encouraging research in areas such as system science and biotechnology. When the University of Singapore was inaugurated in 1962, it had a student enrollment of 2,000. Now it is a training ground for 15,000. In the years ahead, as the social and economic demands of the country changes, the university will continue to train men and women to meet these challenges.
Tuberculosis, a scourge some 40 years ago. In 1948 alone, over 1,600 people died from tuberculosis. The Public Health Service had the burden of controlling this disease. It was a dreaded disease which many feared. Even until today, this fear remains.
I was depressed when I found I had TB, because this sickness is, many people are scared of this sort of sickness because it can spread. And I also have a family with me, so I was worried. I do not know how they're going to accept me in the family because I have this sickness.
Makcik perasaan macam rasa kecewa lah, macam rasa makcik ni macam tak ada harapan nak hidup lama lagi kan. Maksudnya kita dah sakit kan. Jadi makcik rasa takut, dia macam gitulah.
Many of the patients who came for treatment at Tan Tock Seng Hospital were patients who had very advanced or fairly advanced disease, and they had symptoms of cough, coughing out blood, of losing weight, and being really in poor health.
Living and housing conditions then were poor, overcrowded and unhygienic. This was conducive to the spread of TB. It was estimated that 1 out of 20 persons living in the city had TB. In order to arrest the disease, early detection was crucial. Thus began Singapore's battle against TB. A mass X-ray campaign was launched on the 1st of July 1958. It was a pioneer survey aimed at discovering the spread of TB in both urban and rural areas. 4 districts were selected: Chinatown, Jalan Sultan, Geylang and Bukit Panjang. Residents above the age of 14 were surveyed. The medical staff went to the community centers and schools to conduct the X-ray exercise. In order to encourage the working population to turn up for the exercise, X-ray hours were extended to 10 in the evening. For many, being X-rayed was a new experience.
Whenever we went to the area where we would do the X-rays, the people used to crowd round our vans. They were very inquisitive and curious to know what was happening. It was a novelty for them at the time. The response from the people was not very satisfactory because some of them were afraid of radiation. And also there were ladies who were very shy. They thought they had to remove their clothes. We had to convince them that it was not necessary to remove their clothes, and also the radiation given was very negligible.
Nurses had to go from house to house encouraging people to come for the X-ray screenings. And Vans with loudspeakers also went out on the roads to publicize the campaign. Despite the publicity given, people were still reluctant to be x-rayed. TB then was a disease much feared. Staff nurse Roberto recalls the stigma attached to the disease.
Usually, patients do not want their relatives and friends to know about their disease because they might be shunned. And employers, if they should come to know of the illness, they might lose a job. And fear of the long-term treatment, which requires hospitalization and in hospitalization and loss of employment.
The 1958 campaign lasted 4 months, and by then some 51,000 people were x-rayed. It had a positive effect. It was discovered that about 2,000 people were infected with TB and needed treatment. At that time, Tan Tock Seng was the main hospital for treating TB. The control unit also monitored new cases that were being discovered. After the 1958 campaign, the fight against TB continued relentlessly with the help of mobile X-ray vans. Voluntary organizations such as SATA carried out joint surveys with the government. This allowed a greater percentage of the population to be surveyed. Community leaders also lent support by participating in the exercise. To drive the message further home, anti-TB exhibitions were held. This was not only to allay the fears of the people, but also to educate the public on the necessity of X-ray screenings. Another major step undertaken was the introduction of the vaccine BCG. BCG vaccination was made compulsory for newborn infants as well as school children. These vaccinations helped to protect and immunize the young against TB. All these measures helped to control the spread of TB. With early detection and use of new effective medicine, the fearful disease was cut down to size. The number of deaths fell from 1,680 in 1948 to 168 in 1985. But with TB under control, there were still other health problems to overcome. Under the new government in 1959, steps were taken to establish a coordinated public health service. A crucial feature was to bring medical services to the people. Nurses and midwives began visiting homes, giving treatment and immunization injections to children, as well as advice on childcare. At the same time, maternal and childcare clinics were set up. This was where mothers could go to have the babies examined. To solve the problem of overcrowding in hospitals, separate outpatient clinics were built in various districts to treat the patients. Even today, this concept of bringing medical services to the people prevails. With most of the population living in flats, polyclinics were introduced. These clinics provide a combination of services, outpatient treatment for general illness, as well as maternal and childcare. At present, there are 12 such clinics located at various housing estates. Our health service has come a long way in providing medical care for Singaporeans. Today, it is meeting new demands and challenges.
Now with the control of tuberculosis and other infectious diseases, we can now focus our attention on the killers of today, namely cancers, heart disease, and strokes, and also in the development and strengthening of our subspecialties.
The medical service is now heading towards specialization in areas such as cardiothoracic surgery and neurology. Research, especially in the treatment of cancers, is given paramount importance. with the availability of modern technology and the expertise of the medical staff, the aim of the medical service is to provide better and efficient healthcare for all Singaporeans. Bustling industrial town and home to some 1,800 factories. But some 25 years ago, few could envisage that this manufacturing heart of Singapore would emerge from a wasteland of swamp and forest. It was on this windswept, empty tract of land that the first factory was built. The National Iron and Steel Mill began operation on the 2nd of August, 1963. Financed solely by local entrepreneurs, the mill was the first of its kind to be established. Opened by Dr. Goh Keng Swee, the mill was seen as an important catalyst for industrialization. It was to supply the steel products to the expanding construction industry. At the same time, it could provide employment to some 400 workers. The opening of the National Iron and Steel Mill not only marked the birth of an industrial town, but also Singapore's first bold step on the road to industrialization. In the late 50s, Singapore was burdened with a load of economic problems. Jobs were scarce. It was estimated that over 35,000 people were without jobs. Unemployment in 1959 stood at an alarming rate of 13%, and this was made worse by a rapidly growing population. At the same time, some 20,000 school leavers were entering the job market. The traditional entrepôt trade and commerce could no longer generate enough jobs that were needed urgently. Industrialization was the only solution. In 1960, the United Nations survey team involved in the planning of the industrialization program recommended that an industrial town at Jurong be built. Located at the southwestern corner of the island, Jurong had a large area of relatively undeveloped land. The town could be built from scratch, unhampered by resettlement problems. Besides, Jurong also had a deep water frontage, ideal for the development of a port. It was a massive operation involving some 9,000 acres of swamp and undulating land. Work began. The forest was cleared, hills leveled, and swamps filled. By 1964, Jurong's transformation was visible as the first few factories began to appear. What attracted industrialists to Jurong?
Some industries, of course, would go there because of the special features that were required by their type of work. Whereas the shipyards need sea frontage, or in the case of National Iron and Steel Mill, they needed a very large site. This was not very easy to get elsewhere in Singapore. But to add to these natural advantages, of course, I think in the planning of Jurong, we put in, I think, special features, the main objective of which was to create conditions in Jurong that were not inferior to elsewhere in Singapore, and if possible, better. So we build standard factory buildings that people could move into quickly. So water, electricity supplies were ensured, so that you would make it very easy for people to start something there that was suitable. On top of that, of course, there's another very attractive feature, I think, for many businessmen, in that land prices and rentals in Jurong were cheaper than elsewhere in Singapore.
At the same time, other incentives were given. Pioneer status, which meant income tax exemption of up to 5 years, were awarded to selected firms. The main economic thrust in the early 60s was labor-intensive, low-skilled manufacturing industries which could absorb the large pool of unemployed workers. Industries such as food and beverages, textiles and garment were considered as key industries for economic development. Swan Sock Factory, a joint venture between local and Japanese entrepreneurs, was one of the many firms in Jurong which provided jobs for the people.
在这个乡村地方，农业也不见得很好啦，在当时的情形啦。那么刚好这边这个工业区开始，那么在偶然的一个机会，我就来这边工作了。
Though jobs were available, people were initially reluctant to work in Jurong. To them, Jurong was too far and isolated. Persuading people to work in Jurong was one of the many problems faced by the pioneer industrialists.
Macam dulu memang susah, nak naik bas pun dalam setengah jam, 1 jam baru ada. Di sini jalan pun tak bagus dulu, jalan tanah merah. Jadi semuanya kampung. Macam saya nak pergi kerja pun goi bersikal datang. Jadi dalam 10 minit ke 15 minit baru sampai dekat bateri ni.
Most workers have to be recruited from all parts of Singapore, mainly from the city. We have to transport them by hire lorry from the city to the factory and return.
To encourage workers to live in Jurong, flats were built. Various social amenities such as shops, clinics, markets, and even schools and banks were provided. Jurong was conceived not only as an industrial estate, but as a self-contained new town. In the mid-60s, separation from Malaysia and the Indonesian confrontation threatened our economic survival. We had to accelerate the industrialization program to provide jobs for an independent nation. But industrialization was not without its uncertainties.
The fundamental problem was that Singapore itself lacked an industrial tradition. We had no tradition of manufacturing. So that our own industrialists, our own businessmen were not quite confident that we could do it. And certainly the foreign investors too had doubts whether Singaporeans could become manufacturers. To overcome that, of course, we had to mount a very heavy training program.
Various joint government training institutes were set up in Jurong. The aim was to train workers to have the essential skills required by the industries. Foreign firms were attracted to set up their own operations. One example is the American oil company Mobil, which chose to build its refinery in mainland Jurong.
Mainly, we were looking for a place to build a refinery in Southeast Asia to supply our requirements throughout the region. At that particular time, the Singapore government was trying to develop the economy in Singapore, and the plan to build an industrial estate in Jurong attracted our attention. The regional location of Singapore as a whole was very attractive to us for logistics reasons, and the location in Jurong itself has proven to be very attractive because it's a better place to operate a refinery than on some of the offshore islands.
Jurong has come a long way since a time when critics termed it as Go's folly. Today, Jurong remains the largest industrial estate. In 25 years, from one isolated factory, it now has about 1,800 factories, employing some 90,000 workers. Jurong embodies an economic vision fulfilled. It created jobs for the nation, put Singapore on the path towards industrialization, and contributed to the development of our economy. Today, the economy has diversified, and the emphasis is on high technology and value-added industries. But the challenges remain the same: the need for Singapore industries to retain their competitive edge and to provide an attractive environment for investors. year was 1967. The war in Vietnam was escalating. American troops and military equipment were pouring into Vietnam in ever-increasing numbers. But as the war dragged on, hopes for a non-communist victory grew dimmer. The battles became grimmer. The destruction continued. The conflict in Indochina coincided with a time of political transition in Southeast Asia. Indonesia, after a period of domestic turmoil, had just ended its campaign of confrontation against Malaysia and Singapore. The new leadership under President Suharto wanted to re-establish ties with its neighbors on a new footing. The attempt at merger between Singapore and Malaysia had also failed, and Singapore found in 1965 that it had to stand on its own. The Philippines, keen on fostering better ties with Malaysia, was also soft-pedaling its claims over Sabah at that time. It was under such circumstances that the 5 countries of Southeast Asia decided to form an organization that would help promote regional cooperation. On the 8th of August 1967, the foreign ministers of Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Thailand and Singapore met in Bangkok to sign a declaration that marked the founding of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN. The main aims of ASEAN, as embodied in the Bangkok Declaration, were to accelerate economic, social, cultural development in the region and to promote regional peace and stability. And for a newly independent Singapore, membership to the organization was important.
In the atmosphere of separation, Singapore welcomed a larger vehicle so that it could conduct relations with Malaysia and Indonesia. An organization of 5 partners meant there were 2 other partners that helped Singapore relate to Malaysia and Indonesia in a new situation.
The early years of ASEAN, however, were relatively quiet. Cooperative efforts were largely confined to non-controversial matters. But slow as the progress was, the years from 1967 to 1975 were important to the 5 culturally diverse nations.
They were not wasted years. These were years when ASEAN leaders learned to deal with each other. They learned more about the principles of conduct, behavior, thinking.
Events in the mid-1970s, however, were to provide the catalyst for greater ASEAN cooperation. In April 1975, the war in Vietnam ended. Saigon, which had held up for so many years against the communist onslaught, had finally fallen. Cambodia and Laos had also come under communist rule. But the fall of Indochina was not the only problem that ASEAN had to confront. The first oil crisis in 1973 had brought about severe economic hardship, the effects of which were immediately felt by the ASEAN economies. Both these events encouraged the ASEAN leaders to work more closely with one another. In 1976, for the first time, the ASEAN heads of government met in Bali to reaffirm their commitment to greater regional cooperation, not only in economic, social and cultural activities, but also in political and security matters. The post-Bali summit era saw the launching of numerous joint endeavors. Some of these include the ASEAN industrial projects and the ASEAN Petroleum Sharing Scheme. Cooperative efforts in agriculture, food sharing and communication have also been undertaken. An ASEAN Secretariat was set up in Jakarta to help further such efforts. But it was in the political arena that ASEAN cooperation was most visibly shown. Vietnam's invasion and occupation of Cambodia in 1978 had caused an exodus of refugees into Thailand. The act of aggression was condemned by ASEAN. But the organization's demand for a Vietnamese withdrawal was at first greeted with some skepticism.
When the ASEAN countries wanted to introduce a resolution requesting the Vietnamese to withdraw and condemn the Vietnamese aggression, and the Vietnamese perm reps told Tomiko, "Why are you wasting time? Nobody's going to listen to you."
But the international community did listen.
The result of the vote is as follows. In favor 91, against 21, abstentions 29. The draft resolution is therefore adopted.
The world has not forgotten.
Since then, support for ASEAN's call for a Vietnamese withdrawal from Cambodia has grown significantly. In 1986, this resolution was passed by an overwhelming vote of 115 to 21. This success at the UN was a clear indication of the international recognition that ASEAN has attained. ASEAN's resilience and success has disproved initial predictions that the member states would not be able to rise above their differences and work towards a common goal. And ASEAN's membership grew with Brunei's entry into the organization in 1984. In many ways, the success of the organization can be attributed to the style that the leaders have adopted in their relations with each other.
All of us treat each other as equal members. Nobody, big or small, has got a veto or has got the last say. And all decisions are taken by consensus. Where there are differences, we will settle them privately and quietly. We will not make them into public issues. Where we have common approaches and share common purposes, we will highlight them and make them public so that the populations will all see that they're working together.
This ability to work together has been extremely important in minimizing differences between the member states and has contributed to a deeper sense of regionalism.
It has created a sense of ASEAN-ness which was never there. We were all different nations with different historical and other backgrounds. But over the last 21 years, there's now a definite feeling that we belong to one group and are part of this area of Southeast Asia.
For Singapore, membership in ASEAN has proven to be useful and beneficial.
ASEAN has provided us an umbrella of peace, cooperation, and goodwill in this area. And now under this umbrella, we've been able to effectively carry out our own economic and social development plans. Because the area as a whole has enjoyed peace, we have been able to maximize the result of our own effort.
The ASEAN countries call for the total...
While ASEAN's more significant achievements have been political in its first 2 decades, matters of economic cooperation have become increasingly vital.
of their right to self-determination.
And this was seen at the 1987 Manila Summit, where the ASEAN states recognized the need to work together in the face of rising calls for protectionism in the West and falling commodity prices.
We need to work together to keep markets open, keep markets outside ASEAN open. We also need to work together to increase intra-ASEAN trade. And the last summit in Manila in December 1987 was important summit because it recognized the need, in spite of these difficulties, to keep our markets open.
And as the ASEAN states continue to work together in the coming years, Each can look back with pride at the achievements of the organization. That the region has enjoyed peace and stability for the past 2 decades is an eloquent testimony to the value of ASEAN to Singapore and the other 5 member states.
Many in Singapore will remember the 9th of August 1965 and how they felt when they heard that Singapore was no longer part of Malaysia.
I felt fearful because I thought that Singapore being a small city-state, we may not be able to defend ourselves.
We had always been brought up to consider Singapore and Malaysia as one economic entity. And now Singapore was on its own. I really wondered what was going to be the result.
Oh, I felt relieved, liberated. I felt like a young girl who has reached her 21st birthday. I felt now we can do what we think is best for ourselves.
For Singapore, it was thought that merger with Malaya was best for its survival, both economically and politically. A small island republic with no natural resources could not be viable on its own. Besides, Singapore had strong historical and economic links with Malaya, and it seemed most natural for it to be part of the same political system.
Let's get together, sing a happy song.
So many welcomed the formation of Malaysia in 1963. But there were difficulties. For a start, Singapore did not quite fit into the Malaysian political mold. On its own, it had a predominantly Chinese population. The government firmly believed in equality for all races. In Malaysia, however, the central government endorsed the principle of Malay political dominance. The ruling party coalition was led by the United Malays National Organization UMNO and its alliance partners, the Malayan Chinese Association and the Malayan Indian Congress.
The UMNO Malay leaders wanted to create in Malaysia a Malay Malaysia. The People's Action Party government wanted to fight for a Malaysian Malaysia. And this was the non-Malays aspiration for Malaysia. One sought to establish a Malaysia where Malay supremacy and Malay dominance is an accepted fact of life. The PAP's Malaysian Malaysia argued for a equality of treatment for the different racial groups.
Conflict surfaced during the 1963 Singapore general election when Malays in Singapore were asked to vote for the Singapore UMNO by Tunku Abdul Rahman, UMNO leader and Malaysian Prime Minister. The PAP saw this as an intrusion into Singapore's domestic politics. Matters worsened in 1964 when the PAP fielded candidates in the Malaysian general election because the party felt that it should have a pan-Malayan outlook. At its rallies, it not only argued for equality for all races and a Malaysian Malaysia, but also said that it would be a more effective partner for UMNO than the MCA. This caused resentment from both MCA and UMNO leaders. UMNO saw the PAP fight for a non-communal Malaysia as an attempt to change the existing political order in Malaysia. It launched an attack against the PAP. At a convention of 150 Malay organizations in Singapore, Syed Jafar Alba, Secretary General of UMNO, accused the PAP of discriminating against the Malays in Singapore and not helping them to improve economically. He urged Malays to unite to overcome this unfair treatment. The Jawi Malay press, Utusan Melayu, took up the issue against the PAP and further heightened racial feelings. Things came to a head on the 21st of July, 1964. As a procession to celebrate the birthday of Prophet Muhammad approached the Kallang Gas Works, a scuffle broke out. It escalated into a riot as Malays and Chinese turned against each other. Vehicles were burnt, houses set on fire, and innocent people attacked. Curfew was imposed on the whole island, and for a long while, the racial groups lived in fear of each other. Even before the tension could subside, another racial riot broke out on the 5th of September, 1964. Alarmed by the riots, both the UMNO and the PAP agreed not to discuss communal issues publicly for the next 2 years. But there were problems on the economic front as well. In December 1964, Tun Tan Siew Sin, the Malaysian finance minister, wanted Singapore to increase its contribution to the federal fund. The Singapore government was unhappy over this for a number of reasons. It had hoped to benefit economically from a Malaysian common market, but progress towards this end had been slow. Furthermore, Singapore trade had been badly affected by the Indonesian confrontation. For these reasons, Singapore was reluctant to give more to the federal fund. In the months that followed, tension continued to build up. In May 1965, the PAP formed the Malaysian Solidarity Convention, bringing together several major opposition parties from Malaya and Sarawak, who were willing to fight for a democratic Malaysian Malaysia. UMNO members saw the convention as an opposition conspiracy and feared that the Singapore Prime Minister planned a Chinese takeover of Malaysia. The situation had by now become very volatile. To defuse the political tension and to avoid a full-scale racial clash, Tunku Abdul Rahman decided that Singapore had to leave Malaysia.
For some time, there have been differences between the central government and the leaders of the Singapore state government. And these differences take so many forms and are of so many kinds that it has not been possible to resolve them. And so we decided that we must part company.
My first reaction was, of course, shock. I was hurriedly summoned to Kuala Lumpur by the Prime Minister. He was there earlier. I traveled by car. In the early hours of the morning, I think, left Singapore at 1 o'clock. Arrived down there about 6 o'clock. Half days, and there I was told, you are out of Malaysia by the Prime Minister. Now go and think it over. It was, of course, a big shock to me.
In Singapore, the Prime Minister met the press. He too had been unprepared for this turn of events.
I said, when I first met the Tunku at 12:30 on Saturday morning, I was still not convinced that in spite of everything Dr. Goh had told me, I did not believe that there was no other way. I believed then that I could still convince the Tunku that there were a number of other ways
of reducing communal tensions in Malaysia, such as a looser federation. But after my talk with the Tunku, I realized there was no other way than what he thought was the solution. That means we have to leave Malaysia. You know, every time we look back on this moment when we signed this agreement which severed Singapore from Malaysia, it will be a moment of anguish. I mean, for me, it is a moment of anguish because all my life I had believed in merger and the unity of these two territories.
Suddenly, Singapore was thrust with the independence it was unprepared for. The question was whether it could survive as an independent nation.
This concern, in fact, resulted in a certain galvanization of support behind the People's Action Party. I think Singaporeans felt that they really had to stand behind the government in this very new period when we had to work out an existence for ourselves.
In retrospect, of course, what it did was to give Singapore a shot in the arm. People realized they were on their own, and it acted as a catharsis and a sort of liberation of new creativity. And really, Singapore never looked back.
I was involved in the trade union movement way back in 1957, and at that time there were widespread unemployment, and it was a completely different situation from now. There were workers chasing for jobs, wages were low, fringe benefits were minimal, so all these contributed to wide-scale dissatisfaction.
After the attainment of self-government in 1959, Singapore continued to be plagued by industrial strife. Leftist unionists under the Barisan Sosialis fought for control of the labour movement against unions supported by the ruling People's Action Party. In 1963, a massive security operation arrested more than 100 pro-communist trade union and student leaders. This helped to curb industrial unrest. Then came Malaysia.
Sing a happy song, Malaysia forever, 10 million strong.
Singapore had assumed that she could only survive and prosper in union with Malaya. But relations with Malaysia soured and she was forced to withdraw from the Federation in 1965. The sudden separation drove Singapore to seek her own destiny. In 1967, only 2 years into independence, Singapore's struggle for economic survival was dealt another blow when the British announced plans for an accelerated withdrawal of their forces east of Suez. The pullout would have severe implications. The British were then one of the country's largest employers, and their military presence accounted for 15% of the gross national product. The British pullout in 1971 meant the loss of 40,000 jobs. It would affect the livelihood of thousands who were indirectly dependent on the British military presence for their employment and income. It was in such an economic context that the government embarked on a rapid industrialization and job creation program. For industrialization to succeed, it was felt that two factors were essential, namely low wages and a disciplined workforce. Toward this end, two important pieces of labor legislation were enacted on 15th August 1968, the Industrial Relations Amendment Act and the Employment Act. Introducing the two labour bills in Parliament, Mr. Rajaratnam, then Labour Minister, stressed that the days of militant unionism were over.
The time has now come for us, employers, workers, and the people in general, to develop a new outlook. The old slogans, the old cries, the old attitudes of 20 years ago have become irrelevant. In the crucial years ahead, the major objective to which all other issues should be subordinated is this. It is not redistribution of wealth, but the creation of wealth that should be our major and relentless concern.
The new labour legislation sought to reduce wage costs and ensure industrial peace. It was part of the government's overall economic strategy to attract foreign investments and accelerate our industrialization program. The law covered only employees and excluded those in management positions. The Employment Act streamlined working conditions. It curtailed the right of unions to strike, gave employers the sole right to hire and fire, and also increased working hours. Workers also had their overtime, leave and retirement benefits reduced. The second piece of legislation, the Industrial Relations Amendment Act, reinforced management prerogatives. It specified that such issues as promotion, transfer, recruitment, retrenchment, dismissal, reinstatement and allocation of duties were no longer negotiable.
I think it was a tough decision for trade unionists at that time, right? Because to agree with it, then it may create the wrong impression amongst the workers that we are being subjugated by the government and being pushed by the government to accept something which is considered unpleasant. But then it is crucial at that stage for Singapore survival, right? Because we have the withdrawal of British armed forces, which means large-scale unemployment. We were briefed by the government at the time that there's a need to it, and explained to us in detail why it's necessary to introduce these amendments. And if we can get the union support, then I think the chances of Singapore's survival, right, economically is far better. Armed with this explanation and reasoning, we go down to the ground and explain to the workers that the constraints are necessary for our survival and for the long-term interests of Singapore.
The new industrial relations climate meant that management authority was restored and industrial peace secured. By 1969, a year after the passing of the two laws, Singapore enjoyed its first strike-free year. Since then, Singapore has maintained a largely strike-free record. A new generation of workers has grown up, largely unfamiliar with the unrestrained militant unionism of the past. Over the years, a new climate of tripartism has evolved, whereby employers, employees and the government work together to achieve orderly changes. In the area of wage increases, for example, the time-consuming and confrontational method of collective bargaining has given way to orderly wage adjustments under the National Wages Council. Since it was passed in 1968, the Employment Act has been amended twice. In 1972, the restrictions on overtime and bonus payments were relaxed in response to a tightening job market. More recently, in 1984, the Act was again amended to make it more relevant to the needs of the Singapore economy. The amended Act gives employers the flexibility to schedule shift work and to grant more leave benefits. The 1968 labour laws helped to establish a firm framework for industrial peace and stability. With a subsequent increase in foreign investments and job creation, Singapore experienced an unprecedented level of economic growth. Today, Singapore's stable and vibrant economic climate is due, in no small measure, to the foundation laid by the labour laws in the 1960s. August 1955, the then Secretary of State of Colonies, Ellen Lennox Boyd, arrived at a new airport. Hundreds of spectators gathered to witness the opening of Singapore International Airport at Paya Lebar. To build the airport, some 420 hectares of land had to be acquired and cleared, and the rural population resettled. The task took 3 years to complete. The runway was built to international standards and was capable of handling the biggest and fastest commercial aircraft at that time. The airport, with its spacious passenger terminal and hangars, was one of the largest in Southeast Asia. The opening of the airport marked a new era for air transport, as it would put Singapore in the forefront of the great aviation centres in the world. Though the most modern at that time, Paya Lebar was not the first civil airport. Kallang Airport, opened 18 years earlier in 1937, was Singapore's foremost civil airport. Built on the reclaimed Kallang Basin, the airport, with its all-weather circular landing zone and unique control tower, was in the 1930s considered to be the finest aerodrome in the British Empire. Kallang was built not only for aircraft alone, but also had a landing slipway for flying boats or seaplanes of the Imperial Airways. Instead of a runway, planes landed on a circular grass area, and their landings were dictated by wind direction. How did air controllers direct plane landings in those days?
We just flashed them an intermittent green signal for them to join the airport. Once they see that, they make a circle of the airport and then await for a fresh instruction to continue approach to land. That will be given by a steady green light when the aircraft is on the final approach, and he will continue on his approach until he lands. Should it be necessary to stop the aircraft from coming in, we will immediately send a red signal, a flash of red light to him.
In the early years, Singapore served as an important stopover for airlines en route from Europe to the Dutch East Indies and Australia. In 1937, Malaya's first internal air service was inaugurated. Initially using only one de Havilland biplane, named Governor Raffles, it began operating 3 times a week, from Singapore to Kuala Lumpur to Penang. Aviation came to a standstill when the war broke out. The airport fell into the hands of the Japanese. After the war, aviation gained a new lease of life. The post-war period saw the emergence of local regional air companies such as the Malayan Airways. It began operating passenger and airmail services from Singapore to Kuala Lumpur, Ipoh and Penang in 1947. Later, in-flight service was introduced. 2 former air stewardess recall the early days of in-flight service.
This DC-3 carried 23 passengers and 1 air hostess only. And that plane is very small, and we have a very small galley. And this galley, we only can keep 30 set of cutlery and serve 23 passengers with the crew for the whole day. So that we have to wash the cutlery in between flight when we stop over at every station.
There's no TV or music on the plane, and the temperature is quite high, and passengers are given fans to keep them cool.
Later, Malayan Airways expanded its network to include more destinations. For the pilots, flying was very different from what it is today.
Flying was carried out during daylight hours only. Map reading was all important, and the pilot had to look out of the window frequently to check his position with landmarks along the route.
More airlines and larger aircraft were also using Kalang's modern but by now modest facilities. It was apparent that Kallang was inadequate and could not handle these larger and heavier aircraft. As expansion was not possible at Kallang, a site for a new airport at Paya Lebar was found. Paya Lebar marked a new era in air transportation. It was the age of the new generation jets. As larger aircraft were introduced, more and more people were also traveling by air. Air travel was no longer a novelty. By the early 60s, Paya Lebar was handling about 300,000 passengers. Over 30,000 aircraft movements were recorded in a year. The aviation industry was rapidly expanding, and this put pressure on Paya Lebar. Only 7 years into operations, further extensions had to be made. Work began to build a new passenger terminal. The runway was also further extended. These modifications and extensions were necessary in order for Paya Lebar to cope with the increased volume of air traffic passing through Singapore then. The years following saw a rapid increase in the number and types of jet aircraft, such as the supersonic Concorde in 1972. In a period of less than 20 years, the passenger movement had increased sixfold. Some 1.8 million passengers were using the facilities at Paya Lebar annually. During the 70s, air cargo had increased to over 170,000 tons. Aircraft movement had also increased to 51,000 in 1970, and there were over 200 scheduled services operating in and out of Paya Lebar. It was evident in the early 70s that Paya Lebar's facilities were squeezed to the limit. It could not cope. To expand the airport meant encountering several difficulties. To build a second runway, Serangoon River had to be diverted and filled. The airport was also within a residential area, and this would result in the resettlement of some 5,000 families. In addition, air and noise pollution would pose a major problem. Once again, there was a need to search for a new civil airport. It was decided in 1975 that Changi, on the eastern tip of the island, was a suitable location. Changi, built on reclaimed land, was completed in 5.5 years. Opened in 1981, Changi was designed with all the facilities of a modern airport. The immense size and scale of Changi dwarfed that of Paya Lebar and Kallang. Today, Changi is one of the 10 busiest airports in the world. More than 44 international airlines link Singapore to 88 cities. Singapore's civil aviation history has seen the building of 3 airports: Kallang, Paya Lebar, and now Changi. Anticipating future increases in air traffic, provisions have now been made for the further expansion of Changi. Planned and designed with such foresight, Changi will be able to serve Singapore's aviation needs right into the 21st century.
You will have to decide on your future. In the next few months, we shall settle the constitutional arrangements for merger.
The year 1961. Making a total of 36 radio talks in 3 languages, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew was all out to explain to the people the issues behind Singapore's battle for merger with Malaya. Singapore's political and economic future was to be decided a year later by the people in a massive exercise, the referendum on merger, on the 1st of September 1962. There were strong reasons for the merger with Malaya. Although Singapore attained self-government in 1959, the People's Action Party leaders never lost sight of their main political objective, that is, to win full independence from the British. One way to achieve this was to unite with Malaya, which already became independent in 1957. Besides, Malaya and Singapore were separated only by a narrow strip of water. The close proximity had brought about social and economic ties. Malayan rubber, copra and tin were brought south and traded through the Singapore port. At that time, the island's economic survival depended largely on entrepot trade. The merger with Malaya would therefore ensure its hinterland, but there were reservations from the Malayan side. Tunku Abdul Rahman was afraid that the Federation's racial composition would be upset by the addition of 1 million Chinese from Singapore. At that time, there were pro-communist members in the Singapore government who also resisted the idea of merger, simply because Kuala Lumpur was anti-communist. This would hinder their plans for communist expansion. It was only when the Tunku saw the threat posed by the possible communist takeover of Singapore that he considered the proposal for merger. At a luncheon hosted by the Foreign Correspondents Association, the Tunku announced that there could be closer political and economic cooperation between Malaya and Singapore, as well as Sarawak, Borneo and Brunei. 2 months after the Tunku's historic announcement, leaders from Malaya, Singapore and the British North Borneo territories met to discuss the terms of the federation. It was agreed that Singapore would have greater autonomy over its internal affairs than the other member states. Singapore would retain control of education and labour policies in exchange for accepting fewer seats in the federal parliament. Singapore would have its own head of state, a cabinet headed by a prime minister, and its own civil service. But defence, security and external affairs would be controlled by the central government. The people of Singapore would not automatically become Malaysian citizens, but could become federal nationals holding federal passports. These conditions were spelt out in the Singapore government white paper put forward to London in November 1961. The British agreed to these terms. While these negotiations were going on, there was a split within the People's Action Party. Left-wing members left the PAP to form the Barisan Socialists, with Dr. Lee Siew Chow at the helm. Thus began the tussle between the Barisan Socialists and the PAP to win over the hearts and minds of the people. Then the government decided that the people should vote in a nationwide referendum on merger.
While on the one hand, the proposal was put forward as a government proposal, on the other hand, it should be seen to have received the support of the people. Particularly when in the Legislative Assembly, the government had a majority only of 1 seat. So we could not simply push it through. We would have been wrong in it. Even assuming we had a larger majority, I think a referendum was necessary.
The referendum listed 3 options, symbolized by state flags. Option A was represented by the Singapore flag, merger under the terms proposed by the PAP, as spelt out earlier in the Singapore government white paper. Option B, proposed by the Barisan Socialists, meant a complete and unconditional merger on the same terms as Penang and Malacca. Option C, with terms no less favourable than for the Borneo territories, was proposed by Lim Yew Hock of the Singapore People's Alliance. The Barisan Socialists, which was against merger at first, had actually come up with an option for merger. Why?
It was because they were following the CPM argument that Malaya consists of Malaya and Singapore, a truly unified Malaya. So they went along with that line of the CPM. If there were a simple referendum which suggested, well, yes and no, a clear-cut answer, then I think the Barisan Socialists would not have put up, nobody would put up any alternatives at all.
But with 3 alternatives, the political leaders had to convince the people of the option which was deemed best for them.
Your vote, your choice.
There were very big rallies. I recollect Farrer Park one and Fullerton Square for another. Very big rallies for both groups, Barisan and PAP. If anything, the Barisan rallies were bigger and noisier, I would say. The Barisan wielded tremendous power among the masses here, and the whole thing was rather aggressive and was going on alongside, it should be said, all sorts of strikes and trade union demonstrations and other diversions which the Barisan were mounting in general in order to try and discredit the PAP. This is a very noisy and confused period.
On its part, the PAP did not stop at public speeches only. Eye-catching posters highlighted the advantages of merger. The people were assured of equal priority for the 4 languages and autonomy in education and labor policies in the PAP-style merger. One person who prepared such campaign posters was Chanchi Singh.
And there's one poster which says a hand holding a key. You know, on the finger itself, they have written Brunei, Singapore, Malaya, and all that. And the key itself indicates the happiness, the key to happiness. In other words, if we secure a merger, then you hold the key to happiness, you know, to 幸福之时. We issue a lot of, at that time we call 海报, you know, it's something like the pamphlets, and we have got banners, you know.
Besides public rallies, films were screened at community centers showing the people how to vote in the referendum.
Special rights, equality for our 4 languages. Vote for common citizenship, for automatic Malaysian citizenship. Vote for alternative A on referendum day. Vote for our Singapore flag, the symbol for alternative A.
From the psychological point of view, the people of Singapore had become accustomed to the Singapore flag. The Penang flag was foreign to them. So also was the flag of North Borneo and Sarawak. And this was one point which the opposition protested against. They knew that it had a psychological impact on the voters.
In a last-minute bid to counter the merger issue, the Barisan Socialists urged the people to cast blank votes to protest the fact that they were not given an option against merger. This created quite a bit of confusion.
Well, people didn't really understand what was going on. At first, I mean, they were suspicious of the idea of blank votes because you were supposed to be penalized for casting a blank vote, so of course they were reluctant to get themselves into trouble, you see. And then there was this, on top of that came this realization that if you cast a blank vote, it would, in theory, go to the Legislative Assembly, which was dominated by the PAP. So, I mean, why were you voting for the PAP? Why was the Barisan telling you to vote for the PAP? Then the Barisan says, well, and even those who want to vote for the PAP should cast a blank vote, and it's going to show that the whole thing is a nonsense, you see, and that it's against the will of the people. Well, of course, it wasn't against the will of all the people.
Referendum day arrived, September the 1st, 1962. It was an important day, and many even dressed up for the occasion. Voting on the referendum was compulsory. A good 90% of the registered citizens of Singapore turned up to cast their vote for their country's future and theirs. It was a massive exercise, quite like a general election. One citizen, one vote. But unlike an election where certain constituencies may have a walkover, the referendum gave everybody the chance to vote. In the referendum, the counting of votes was centralized at the Singapore Badminton Hall. The people were as eager to know the results as the politicians themselves. If the majority had voted for alternative A, the communists would be soundly defeated. Buses were chartered to bring in ballot boxes from the various polling stations. Some 8,000 civil servants were engaged in carrying out the referendum exercise. The count went on throughout the night and was ready by 8:30 the next morning. But the Barisan Socialists demanded a recount. As the recount started, Dr. Lee Siu Cho and his party members left the Singapore Badminton Hall. By 11 a.m., the results were ready. 71% had voted for option A, the PAP option. Only 1.7% chose the Barisan option and 1.4% option C. And even with 25% blank votes, it was a clear win for the PAP.
Dakar, Malaysia!
The referendum had given the people their choice, and although the merger lasted less than 2 years, it was a step which eventually led to full independence for Singapore.
The official opening of Trade Union House on Shenton Way. It was a gift of the government to the people, fulfilling its 1959 promise to provide a fitting home for the labor movement. By 1965, the National Trade Union Congress, or NTUC, had become the sole confederation of trade unions in Singapore. The NTUC was first set up on the 6th of September 1961, but the history of trade unions goes back to an earlier period. In Singapore, trade unions or organized labor have their origin in the early Chinese societies and guilds. These guilds formed associations of workers and employers. When the colonial government wanted to replace these associations with trade unions, they introduced the first trade union legislation in 1940. But it was not implemented until after the Second World War. After the war, trade unions mushroomed all over. On Middle Road was a cluster of unions representing workers from diverse trades. These unions had one main aim: to improve the workers' lot. For in those days, working conditions were poor. Health and safety measures were almost non-existent. And what's more, wages were very low. To make matters worse, there was widespread discrimination. Those who knew English managed to get better jobs. Such unfair treatment spurred some workers on to take up union leadership.
Well, I must say that at that time, compared with my other colleagues, I do receive regular annual increments. But I see that the majority of my colleagues do not. So because of that, I decided that I ought to do something to help them. So I took that risk with a few very close friends. And of course, in those days when you organize workers, you must try to bring in those who are tough. That means the lower paid workers, the laborers, the mechanics, and all this. These are the bronze.
Taking up leadership in the labor movement was not an easy task. The workers were looking for union leaders who must be willing to sacrifice their own job prospects in order to fight for workers' rights.
Union leaders were not popular among the employers or in any management. But I believe that people like me who really fight for the betterments, we enjoy the negotiation because we find some sort of thrill to get something from the management for the lower income groups. So that is the satisfaction given to us.
But in those days, getting a better deal for the workers
meant frequent confrontation between union and employers. By the 1950s, pro-communists had infiltrated several unions. They would often instigate dissatisfied workers to take strike action.
Well, I think the conditions at the time were very ideal, no? Low wages, anti-union attitude of employers, discrimination in giving up increments and fringe benefits and so on. So the situation was just right for the pro-communist elements to take advantage.
There was hardly any industrial peace so long as decent wages were not given. Caricatures depicted anti-union employers as bullies and persecutors. As left-wing unionists succeeded in clinching higher wages for the workers, their union membership grew. The communists then moved on to capture leadership in the larger unions, such as those representing the transport workers and the key industries. Having done so, the communists would stir up trouble for the government by inciting dissatisfied workers to stage protest strikes and work stoppages. The frequent strikes prompted the newly elected PAP government to take firm action to secure industrial peace. The labor movement was to undergo major changes. The split in the union leadership came when the pro-communists broke away from the PAP ranks and started their own affiliate union, SATU. The moderates formed the NTUC under C.V. Devanaya, but the majority of unions in the private sector was still controlled by SATU.
It was a difficult task for the NTUC, right, to project itself as the national body, as the apex organization that are in a better position to look after the long-term interests of workers. Some thought that those under the pro-left are more powerful, are able to take on the employers, right, through industrial actions, whereas those under the NTUC are pro-government, they're less likely to take strike action.
However, the communist-backed unions were bringing up more and more political issues instead of fighting strictly for workers' rights. Hundreds of man-hours were lost, but workers' welfare did not improve. The popularity of SATU was short-lived. February 1963, in Operation Cold Store, the Internal Security Council rounded up all the key leaders from the pro-communist SATU unions and the Barisan Socialists. Several unions were deregistered because of illegal activities. SATU was banned by the government. This move effectively crippled the militant union movement. The stage was set for labor reforms. To prevent further outbreaks of labor unrest, the government tightened legislation of unions. Strikes without proper notice were deemed illegal and offenders liable for jail sentence. The Industrial Arbitration Court was set up to provide a peaceful means to settle industrial disputes between labor and management. This paved the way for a more stable climate of industrial relations. Then, in 1967, came the first watershed for the reformed labor movement. The withdrawal of British bases here meant that many would lose their jobs. The government had to act fast to prevent massive unemployment. Everybody had to work together for the country's survival, to maintain a peaceful and stable industrial climate that would attract foreign investments and more jobs for the people. So in 1968, new labor laws were passed. They included restrictions on union activities, longer working hours, and lesser fringe benefits. Workers had to be told the rationale behind the new laws.
We will have to explain to them the true facts. Whether you will have to go on hunger or you go and get a job with lesser fringe benefits, which one is preferred? We are explained to them, and they also sensible enough to understand the situation, and they have accepted.
Accepting the labor laws was as crucial as launching Singapore's industrialization program. More new jobs were created, and export earnings went up. With secure jobs and reasonable wages, workers were happy. Instead of wage fights, unions now took time to organize recreational and social activities for their members and families. A new era for the labor movement came in 1969. It was a step towards a modernization program. At the historic modernization seminar, new targets and action programs were defined for the trade union movement. It was to look at not wages alone, but the workers' total welfare. As a result, unions were encouraged to start cooperatives, such as a Welcome Supermarket, where bulk purchases by the cooperative brought down the prices of consumer basics. NTUC's transport cooperative, Comfort, offered a vehicle purchasing scheme where taxi drivers could own their own vehicles after a few years. Then, in 1972, the National Wages Council was formed, bringing together three parties, the government, the employer and the worker, to discuss wage changes. So successful were such tripartite negotiations that the NWC recommendations benefited non-unionized workers too. Today's rapid automation of industries would not be possible without strong understanding between labor and government. Retraining and upgrading workers to meet the country's economic needs is as much the concern of unions as of policy makers. Cooperation and industrial peace is today's norm, a far cry from the confrontation and strikes of yesteryear's union movement.